right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of Drupal GovCon. Um, this session is tips for securing your Drupal application, and we'll go over some items to audit within your Drupal 8 or 9 application to ensure optimal security. For the purpose of clarity through this presentation, we'll look at this from the perspective of you have built a Drupal application. Ideally, all of your features are complete and you're about to launch. So you're doing a pre-launch security audit. Before I go into the agenda, I want to introduce myself. My name is Beverly Lanning. You might have seen me around the community known as B. Marlin. That's my Drupal.org username, CodePen, GitHub, Reddit, Twitter, everything. That's me. And I'm a senior technical architect at Acquia. I've been at Acquia for about 2.5 years now. All right, so some of the agenda items for today. First, of course, it wouldn't be a proper presentation without going over the importance of security audits. And I'll also give a couple recommendations for those. Then we'll get into some security items to check for. So first, some known vulnerabilities, and we'll touch specifically on the JSON API. We'll go over common configuration, whole section for users and roles specifically, platform configuration. I know this is more geared toward like the Drupal application, but there's a couple of things that I feel obligated to call out from a platform level. So we'll go over those just really quick. We'll talk about some security modules, including Security Kit. There are so many customers that I see that will install and enable the Security Kit module and not set it up at all, which makes it almost useless. So we'll talk about some of those configurations that you should set up. And then we'll end with some uncommon configuration and touch just briefly on some custom modules and themes. So first and foremost, the importance of security audits. The most obvious one is that we want to proactively search for any vulnerabilities and resolve those. If we don't find the vulnerabilities before we launch, in time, somebody will find them for us. And it's usually not someone within your organization. Second, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of configuration that you might turn on for development that isn't going to usually be safe in production. So during active development, we might turn on PHP errors in the browser and things like that you don't actually want to carry over to production during launch. There's also misconfigurations from human error in general. There will be things that you don't think about that go through code review, that go through QA, UAT, and it gets missed. So this is kind of like a last-ditch opportunity to find those and correct those. And kind of along those same lines, there's high-level items that we simply just forget about. So you think about when you install Drupal 8 or 9 for the first time, there's already an anonymous and authenticated role. But when is the last time that you had a project where you added a ticket to make sure those roles had the proper permissions that they need and make sure they don't have permissions to things that you don't want them to? So there's some high-level item things like that we just tend to forget about that can be caught during the security audits. And of course, I want to call out displaying external data. If you are pulling data from an API into your site, it's hard to trust external sources. Your site may be doing things mostly correct, but the third-party site has been hacked or there's been some bad data entered or whatever, and it will cause problems on your site if you do not sanitize that information coming in. All right, so some security audit recommendations. At Acquia, I work in professional services. So for the most part, we're doing Drupal builds for customers, but we do some like short-term workshops, including like doing a security or performance audit for someone who has built their own application. So in doing those security audits, there's a couple of things that I would recommend to someone doing their own audit. And the first one is to make sure that you're auditing with plenty of time to actually resolve the vulnerabilities that you find. And this can be really tricky because you want to make sure that your features are built and you don't do your audit and you add all this code that could be unsecure. So you want to make sure that your features are built, but you also want to make sure you have time to actually fix the items before you launch. So it can be a little bit tricky. I would say the most ideal scenario is you do your audit, the audit is complete, you have a log of all of your items, and you have like one fix sprint left before you launch. It may be hard for some small companies or small teams, but ideally, if you can have someone do the audit who is not close to the project, that's most ideal. If you have someone who has been actively working on the project every day doing the audit, there's some things that are going to be overlooked. And we all know that fresh eyes usually bring some fresh perspective, and it's easier to find things. As that person is going through and finding items, I would definitely recommend logging the severity of those items. So the items that we talk about today, there's some that are going to be obviously like high severity, and there's some that are more moderate or low severity. So as you're going through and logging those items, the severity is going to differ depending on your organization and your application. So it's hard to for sure say what the severity of some items should be, but you should make an estimate as you're logging. That way you can prioritize the most severe items first. And then lastly, the security, this should be continually evaluated. You should not do a security audit right before launch and then never do a security audit again. We all know the web is evolving. We continue to add features to our site ongoing. So you want to do a security audit, come up with some sort of governance in your organization for this. So I would say if you're adding a minor amount of features over time, once your application is launched, doing something like maybe an annual audit or something like that would probably be fine. If you're adding, features kind of more often, then I would definitely recommend doing audits more frequently. Okay, so let's get into some known vulnerabilities. The most obvious one is keep Drupal core up to date and contrib modules up to date. Keep those up to date. It makes, first of all, it makes your application so much harder to update if you wait for so long and you have a slew of things that you have to update all at once. But also those updates include security updates. So that's one of the easiest things you can do to make sure that your application is secure and you're really utilizing the Drupal community, helping to keep your application secure. Second, remove any unused modules. It's super easy during active development to add modules that you think you're going to use, and then you either end up not needing them or you don't need them really after development is done. To put it simply, the more code you have in your application, the more possible vulnerabilities that exist. So one of the easiest things you can do is just make sure you remove modules that you're not actually using. And then some modules, this is not an all-encompassing list, but there's some modules I wanted to call out to know that you probably should not have enabled on production. And this includes UI modules like the field UI and views UI. So thinking that we're talking about Drupal 8 and 9 applications, by now you should have some sort of configuration management strategy where you're making config changes never on production, but you're doing it in some sort of like lower environment, like a local or dev. You're exporting that config, you import it into production. So with that being said, there is no reason why any users should have access to make field configuration changes or views changes in the UI. So this is a security, but also like a whoopsie proof kind of thing. You should go ahead and just disable this on production. Also QA accounts. So this module, we use it a lot when we are, doing QA or UAT for user roles and permissions. So it's easy to add that module and then again, forget about it. But if you have that QA accounts module, there's a potential that you have some usernames and things like that that are a little more common or known. So it makes your site a little bit more vulnerable. And kind of similar to the QA accounts, there's many development modules that we should always have turned off in production, such as Devel or Web Profiler, things like that. Those are exposed PHP injections on your site, and you absolutely don't want that. So all development modules should be turned off. And any migration modules as well. So if you installed and enabled some migration modules and your migrations have already been rolled, go ahead and turn those modules off and probably remove them completely from the code base. It kind of goes into like the second item where you just want to remove unused modules for code, but you also don't want the possibility of somebody accidentally running a migration and all of a sudden your content is wrong on your site. Also consider removing any unused views. So there's a lot of views that come out of the box with Drupal core. Not all of them are always used. So you should remove those if they're not in use by anonymous or authenticated users. It just reduces the number of connections to your database. And the last two items here, these are going to be like more like lower priority or just items to flag. But you should probably flag and just be mindful of the fact that, if you've got an application and you have a high number of patched modules, might be something you want to take a look at, just like a second look at. Or more particularly, if you have a module, a single module, and it has a lot of patches, maybe consider looking to see if there's other options for that module or other, like whatever functionality that module is providing. Just see if maybe if there's some other ways to do it that don't require so many patches. Because again, as a flag, it could be the possibility that that module is really no longer maintained. It's not getting security updates, whatever. So it's just an item to flag. And in addition to that, make sure you review modules that are not supported by the Drupal security team. So it's going to be my job right now to tell you that you should try to not use modules that are not supported by the Drupal security team. In practice, there are modules that we use, at least a few that are not approved by the security team. So this is one of those things where, again, just be mindful of what that means. So it means that you need to review the code and make sure you're comfortable with using that module on your site. But it also means that you need to be aware of the fact that there may not be security updates coming for that module. So any sort of like vulnerabilities, you'd have to take care of yourself. And as promised, I wanted to just quickly call out the JSON API module. This is actually now included in Drupal core. I can't remember what minor version in Drupal 8 that it was introduced in core 2. But the JSON API module is excellent if you need to expose data on your site for other things to access. However, the small problem with JSON API is it really should be bundled with the JSON API extras module. And the reason why is because JSON API does this cool thing where it creates all of these endpoints for all of this data. But most of the time, 99% of the time, you don't need absolutely all of the content on your site to be exposed with an endpoint. So the JSON API extras module allows you to select which endpoints are available, and you can turn off the endpoints that you don't want. So for example, if you want to make sure that you have a feed for published articles on your site, great. That probably means you could turn off the feeds that expose your taxonomy terms and your usernames and things like that. I actually included a link on here to the Drupal.org page that talks about the JSON API module security concerns. If you're using JSON API on your site, I highly recommend at least skimming through this and just making sure that you are aware of how to make sure that your endpoints are secure. All right, so looking at some common configuration. I also want to call out just really quickly, I should have called this out at the beginning, that every single one of these things that we talk about, there's going to be a use case where you can say, no, you shouldn't, or you should do that in this scenario. And every application is different, and that's fine. So this does not account for every single scenario. This is a general like best practice kind of thing. So for example, that second point, whereas if possible, the user registration form should be limited to admins. The GovCon site is a great example of no, people need to be able to create their own user registration, and that's fine. But just as like general practice, if it's not absolutely necessary to the functionality of your site, turn it off and make sure only admins have the ability to add users. That first one kind of goes back to when we were talking about the high-level items that we just sometimes forget to review. You want to make sure that as part of your security audit, you're reviewing permissions for the anonymous and authenticated user roles. Ideally, you would review it for all the roles, but especially make sure you're looking at authenticated and anonymous users. Going to the third option, the text format and editor configuration. I see this a lot where customers will not have their text editors, like what you're using, the WYSIWYG you're using in the body field. They're not limiting the allowed HTML tags or correcting the faulty HTML. And the problem with this is if you are not limiting the HTML tags that can be entered into the body field or these other long text fields, you introduce security concerns. And I'll touch on that in just one moment. But you want to make sure that whatever text editor your user roles have, it has the option for limit allowed HTML tags turned on. You have the allowed HTML tags defined as what is there in the screenshot. And if you can recall, envision what this screen looks like in the UI, just above this section, there's actually another section where you do little checkboxes of all the items that you want to restrict. And you can also drag and drop to weight those. This should always be the last weighted option. Everything else should come above it. So with these text formats and editors, not limiting these kind of tags can make your site vulnerable to cross-site scripting attacks. And again, there's going to be use cases for everything, but in general, you should be wary of tags that can include injecting some sort of third-party code onto your site. So tags like embed, form, iframe, HTML, input, object scripts. Um, Again, there's use cases, but these are some things that you should be wary of. And if these are not being restricted, just make sure that that's indeed correct. Next is implement spam prevention on forms. Honeypot is excellent. You can also use CAPTCHA or reCAPTCHA, things like that. And then ensure errors are not shown on the screen in production. So you can add this little line here to your settings.php file. It just makes sure that any errors are not displayed on the browser to anonymous users. And this is good because error messages could potentially expose like what your vulnerability is. So making sure those are turned off in production is great. Next, ensure all of your views have some sort of access control configured. So in this example here, looking at the search page, the access is allow people to get access to it if they have permission to view published content. Something as simple as that is fine. You just want to make sure that there is some sort of access control configured on all of your views. This is anytime you add a new view, there is not automatically an access configured, so you want to make sure that you add something there. All right, and kind of going into users and roles, I would say the first thing to look for is make sure that it should always be a very small number of users that have the Drupal admin role. That admin role that comes out of the box is super dangerous. And you might be saying, well, there's people in our organization, like IT needs to be an admin, and our developers need to be an admin, and we've got site builders that use Layout Builder that need to be admins. And they don't. You can make roles like a developer role or a site builder role that has a lot of permissions. They can have elevated permissions, but there are going to be some things that they don't need access to. So consider when you're thinking about your roles and permissions, think about your content editors, like that sort of audience, but also think about the technical audience as well. And again, this is for security, but it's also one of those oopsie kind of proof things as well. Next, make sure you're securing user one. User one is the user. If you do Drush ULI, that's who you're being logged in under. That Drupal.org link there has some options and a little bit more information on why this is super important and your different options. But the kind of general options here are you can either disable that user, and I wanted to call out with Drush, you can both block and unblock that user. So don't be scared to disable that user thinking that you can never retrieve it back, because you can. The second one is if you need to keep user one, I would just say not to use an obvious name like admin. Make it some sort of like funky username, and definitely use a randomly generated password and use a strong password, like 16 characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters, all that good stuff. And then also consider using some modules that will help you against brute force attacks. So the flood control and login security are two modules that are commonly used for that as well. All right. And again, just like an item to flag, if there's a large number of roles in your system, might be something maybe you spend just a couple extra minutes looking over. It's possible that some of those roles are not in use, in which case you should remove those unused roles. If you keep a whole bunch of roles around that are not in use, who knows what that role has access to. A new user could be added and they could get that role, and who knows what that means. So the more roles you have, the more confusing it can be for when you're adding new users, what role they clearly need to have. So just flag it, think about it, see if it's possible for you to remove some roles and maybe investigate in combining. Prior to launch, no test user account should be in production. So we mentioned the QA accounts module that should not be there, but this includes any manually added test accounts that you have. There should not be any users that are not like truly active on the site. And you should create some sort of governance around auditing your accounts. So maybe each quarter, you go in and you look at the last time these people have actually logged in. If there's a user who hasn't logged into the site in 6 months, maybe you block them. You don't have to delete them. You can block them. That way you can unblock them in the future. It's fine. It's not personal. But if they haven't logged in 6 months, then it's probably more likely that they don't need to maybe have access to the site, at least not right now. And so limiting the amount of users that you have on your site is just, obvious security. And also consider some of the username and password protection modules that are out there. So password policy is excellent to enforce password security. There's also like the two-factor authentication, single sign-on. All of those can also help make sure that there's protection with your users. All right. Like I said, we are mostly focusing on the Drupal application, but I am not doing you justice if I don't want to at least call out these couple platform configuration items. So real quick, I'm going to tell you need to enforce HTTPS. Sorry, I know that's not obvious. You should enforce HTTPS, but actually, more importantly, you need to make sure that either in your htaccess file or in your settings.php, because you can do it there as well, make sure you have a redirect. So if users try to load your site over HTTP, they are automatically redirected to HTTPS. Whoever your hosting provider is, make sure that there's a private public key system going on for any like SSH, SFTP, things like that. Review your host user permissions. So if you have a login to your hosting platform, like if you use Acquia, for example, those users also have their own roles and permissions specific to the platform that doesn't affect Drupal. So we mentioned making sure that you're reviewing your users that are in Drupal, but maybe also review the permissions on your hosting platform as well. Of course, consider a CDN or web application firewall for obvious reasons. And also consider using the Shield module on non-production environments. So we always use this on production environments prior to launch, but even post-launch, you should consider leaving the Shield module on your non-production environments, just to make sure that there's no inappropriate content out there that somebody just happens to come along and find your dev or stage site. This Shield module will add like a basic like username and password to be able to see the content. Also consider using some performance or security software like New Relic for audits. If you are, for example, like an Acquia customer that uses Acquia Cloud Enterprise or above, this is something that comes like free for you. You just have to enable it and turn it on. I wouldn't recommend turning these things on and leaving them on because it can have performance impacts on your site. But consider some sort of software like this. A lot of web hosting platforms will have something similar. It may not be New Relic, but it might be some other software that comes with it. And lastly, place your configuration directory outside of your Drupal root. So whether it's web, doc root, whatever your hosting platform is, I highly recommend that you have your config directory one path outside of your doc root, and you place it under config/default. Or if you're doing multi-site, you could do config/site/ and then whatever the site is. This is an item that we always do, and it just ensures that your config is not ever in any way able to be exposed in the browser. All right, so let's look at some security modules. So we've talked about Shield. We also talked about Honeypot and CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA for forms. I do want to add the caveat that the CAPTCHA modules do bypass cache. So if you have forms or web forms on every single page on your site, maybe don't consider using CAPTCHA for everything because your whole site is then like bypassing cache. So it's one of the security versus performance trade-offs. So just be aware of that when you're thinking about the web form security. Single sign-on, two-factor authentication, we talked about that. We talked about password policy. The username enumeration prevention is also a nifty module. So as a hacker that is well-versed in Drupal, I know that I could go to your site and I could do /user/ and then somebody's username. And if I get a 403, that means that user exists on your site. So this module will do things like make sure that returns are 404, so it's not obvious to those users that that's a user on your site. It also prevents some potentially exposing messages on your site as well. So for example, Drupal will return errors or messages saying if a user is blocked or if a user is not activated yet. And again, those kind of expose information to hackers, letting them know that that user exists or what state that user is in. And finally, the security kit module, also known as SecKit. So I don't want to completely bore you with all this because this stuff is boring to me, so it might be boring to you. But I want to quickly go through some of the items that you really, really should configure in the security kit module. This is not an all-encompassing list, and I have links to all of these items because this is super high level, and you should absolutely read about these items more. But for the sake of getting through some of these, the first one, like XXSS protection, this stops pages from loading when they detect that there's some sort of cross site script attack happening. So if you have the SecKit and module already installed, when you're on that configuration screen, this is located under the cross-site scripting section. And you can set this to either modify the dangerous content or you can block the entire page. My preference would be to block the entire page. And I want to call out most of these, including this one. If you are not using the SecKit module or you can't use that module for some reason, most of these headers you can either configure on your CDN or WAF provider, or you can add them to your htaccess file. So there are some options, again, if you can't use the security kit module for whatever reason. Next is HTTP content security policy. So this protects against cross-site scripting attacks by whitelisting the sources of approved content and preventing the browsers from loading malicious assets. So under, again, the cross-site scripting section, you need to set this to true and then also configure what those trustworthy sources are. Next is HTTP, strict transport security. This strengthens your TLS by getting the web browser to enforce the use of HTTPS, which prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. So this is located under the SSL/TLS section, and you'll want to set this to true. Again, this is one of those items where if you can't use the SecKit module for whatever reason, usually your CDN or WAF provider might be able to give you the option to configure this, or you can add it in the htaccess. HTTP referrer policy. This allows your site to control what information the browser includes when the user is navigating away from your page or from your site. So this is located under the miscellaneous section on that configuration page. You need to set this to true, and you also want to select which policy option. If you're happy for other sites to see referrer data from your site, I would recommend using the no referrer when downgrade option. This means that assuming your site is loaded over HTTPS, it's happy to share any and all data it has, assuming the user is going to another HTTPS site. It will not send information if they're going to an HTTP site. And if you don't want to share referrer information, you can use strict origin or no referrer. And again, this is an option that is usually available with your CDN or WAF and can be configured in your htaccess. All right, HTTP X-frame options. This tells the browser whether your site should be framed and protects visitors against clickjacking attacks. So this is saying if another website, for example, can iframe and source your site. This is something that's located under the clickjacking section of the SecKit configuration page, and you'll want to select which option you have. I included a link to some X-frame options with more information because as you can see from the screenshot on the right side, some of these options are not always available in certain versions of browsers. So it's really important that you review these options and make the decision for what's best for your application and organization. So you have the option to deny, which would reject any sort of attempt from framing same origin, which would be within the same domain, and then allow from. So you can specify which sources have access to framing. All right, I want to get into some perhaps uncommon configuration. The first one is sensitive credentials in your code, such as API keys or passwords, should not be in your code. They should not be like git committed. It should not be stored in your repo. Ideally, it's not inside of your Drupal code base anywhere. So if you're an Acquia customer, there is the ability to add a secrets.settings.php file on your server, and you can add your secrets there, and the Drupal application can call to that file to retrieve it. That way, those credentials aren't actually in your code base. Depending on who your web hosting provider is, most of them, again, have like some sort of option like this. So just, try to store that information outside of your code base. If you haven't ever before read some of the differences between using the private and public file system in Drupal, you should read about it, and you should make sure you're using it properly. The public file system is anybody on the web can see these files. The private system is actually served through Drupal, so it respects the security access that you have defined in Drupal. Ensure forms restrict file extensions and file upload size. So of course, if for some reason you've got like a comments box that anonymous users can see and they can upload files for some reason, God forbid, please do not give them access to upload any file they want, including whatever size file they want. That is super dangerous. And you should also consider this for your content editors as well. If it's an image media type, for example, should your content editors have the ability to upload a 10 megabyte image? Probably not. They probably need to figure out how to go to the design team and get a compressed image. So just consider what these restrictions need to be and make sure that your media fields are set accordingly. And if you're using Simple SAML, one of the first things you need to make sure you do prior to launch is that you turn off the error output to the browser. So under the Simple SAML library, in the config.php, there is an option in the config array for show errors. I'm pretty sure that's set to true by default, and you probably want that as true when you're debugging and you're setting it up for the first time. Make sure you set that to false before you launch. And then there's tons of files that come with the Simple SAML library. You don't usually need all of them depending on how you're configuring it, so you should remove any files that are not applicable to your application. All right, and I'll quickly touch on some custom module code and themes. If you didn't get a chance to attend Mike Madison's Writing Secure Code session on Wednesday, I highly recommend that you check it out. Probably most, if not all the things in here, he probably reviewed in more detail during that session. So if this is something that interests you and you want some more like tips that are included in here, definitely check out that session. The first one is we use console log and JS files. We use dump, all of these things during development. So just make sure you either grep or whatever you use to find and replace things. Make sure you look for those items in your code and remove those prior to launch. Next, in your custom modules, if you're using custom routes, make sure that you are actually validating those route parameters. So in this example, we've got a path for /example/name. And with the context of this module, I know that name variable is going to be a string that contains only upper and lowercase alphabet characters, in which case we can use regex here to define that and also set permissions. Next, ensure text and code is sanitized and secure. So this kind of goes back to, especially if you're pulling external data and you're displaying it on your site, super important to make sure that that information is sanitized in such a way that it doesn't put you at risk. So these are just a couple things that I wanted to include here. The first one, as far as entering attributes in Twig templates, always make sure that you're using single or double quotes. Doing class equals the class variable and quotes is safe. Not using the quotes is no longer safe, depending on what the variable is. If possible, don't use the raw filter in Twig. Again, there's going to be use cases for everything, but general rule, you should not use raw because it bypasses, it escapes the output. The translation API, you've probably seen it in code, the little T function that translates our stuff. It's fantastic because it constructs these safe and translatable strings. And you can use it everywhere. So this is an example of using it in PHP, example of using it in JavaScript, and also in Twig. So use Translate API, and also I wanted to include another link for more ways to escape text, including making sure whether it's in JavaScript or PHP, whatever, you're properly escaping text, making sure that there's no possibility for things that either anonymous users or authenticated users on your site are entering that could be dangerous. And lastly, this probably falls on like maybe the lower priority items, but make sure you review any to-dos that are in your code. You just want to make sure that there's no temporary code that was added that maybe shouldn't go to production and be permanent. So review those to-dos and make sure that that those are safe. All right, and that's the end of the agenda. Just a couple slides here real quick. I wanted to call out that Acquia is hiring. So if you're looking for a new opportunity, or if you know someone in the Drupal community that's looking for an opportunity, we have roles right now. We're looking for technical architects, Drupal developers, and technical account managers. You're welcome to email our recruiter, Anthony, directly, or you can check out the acquia.com/careers. And finally, I would love to stay in touch. Like I said, I'm known mostly everywhere as B Marlin, but there's also my LinkedIn information there. I love to talk Drupal. I love to partner with people to do talks and conferences. So please keep in touch with any questions, comments, anything I can do to help. I would love to. So with that being said, I have not really been watching the chat. Are there any questions that we have?
Hey, yeah, there are a few questions. So it looks like firstly in the chat, there's some conversation about the JavaScript being allowed, and it's also sort of a bane of migration because sometimes you have to, have the unsafe air quote form text format to manually move over. And a sort of follow up to that is like John asks, could you sniff for JS dynamically set only to those text boxes with JS to the dangerous one? So towards the top.
Yeah, sorry. So we need to create unsafe text formats, manually move content over to safe text formats. If this is in regards to like migration using Migrate API, and you're migrating content into like Drupal 8 or Drupal 9, we usually will create. I mean, there's like migration plugins that you can use anyway that I think will strip information out. But there's been a lot of cases, for example, where we are taking someone from Drupal 7 and bringing them to Drupal 9, and they have all kind of like code in their body field. They've got like JavaScript, script tags, all kind of stuff. And like we need to strip that information out, but retain like maybe some of the text that's contained in them. So there's actually, I'm pretty sure on Drupal.org, there is examples that we followed as far as stripping out some of that unsafe markup and retaining the information inside there. I will say most of the time there's going to be some manual intervention that has to happen. It's just inevitable. It's usually common when you're doing a migration anyway, but especially if there's some markup like that you're stripping out, it will need to be reviewed.
John and Josh, feel free to answer in chat or join us if you want to talk more about that. But I'll go ahead and move on to the next comment question is Max brought up that CAPTCHA can also present a lot of accessibility issues for some users. So just to use like honeypot or other measures first is always a sort of good first round of defense. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is my preferred method. Like if we can get away with just using honeypot, honeypot is an excellent like module / method if you are not familiar with it. I personally try to not use CAPTCHA or reCAPTCHA at all, exactly for the accessibility concern. For some reason, when Google returns the CAPTCHA where you have to select the images to make sure you're a real person, that also sometimes seems to be really buggy on mobile devices. So yeah, I don't love using CAPTCHA or reCAPTCHA. Please don't hate me for saying that if you use it. But yeah, you should, if you can get away with just using Honeypot or some of those other methods, I would do that as well.
Cool. Moving over to the Q&A tab, someone asked where you got your shirt. I went ahead and found the link, so I will drop it in chat. It's from the DrupalCon swag shop. So anyways, moving on to the rest of the questions in there. We have someone asking about what about Layout Builder requiring Field UI turned on in production, and if there's a way around that.
Off the top of my head, I don't know if there's a way around that. At least off the top of my head, I'd have to research and see.
Okay. A reminder from Josh to if you could please post your slides. You look like you have some great links in there for everyone. And then another question from Josh is, does Acquia hosting allow for environmental variables or environment variables?
Yes. And if you're using, for example, like BLT, it's one of the tools that we have at Acquia that we use in professional services on pretty much all of our projects. It automates some general things like deployments. It adds some like Git hooks to make sure that your Git commit messages and all that are standardized. Yeah, so that BLT tool especially already includes the code that you need for environment variables as well.
Okay, and one more question is there a way to always return a 404 when a 403 is returned?
Yes, and we have done this. So I think there's probably a code snippet that you can add in there, but honestly, we did this recently, and we also just themed the 403 like a 404. So like if you're looking for a quick way, like you don't want to return a 403 at all, you can at least like kind of fake like hack it in your browser and just have the 403 template look like a 404 page too.
Cool. Well, other than just posting your slides in chat, does anyone else have any other questions before we wrap up the session for today? It looks like someone in chat mentioned that php.env is a good tool too, if you happen to have any experience with that.
I actually do not. But if it's a great tool, I love it and I would want to check it out.
Cool.
Setting up environment variables. Yeah, got it.
Looks like Janice just posted what you use instead of, is it JRAW or dash raw? We need to pass WYSIWYG text into Pattern Lab.
Sorry, where is this question?
It's in the Q&A tab.
Oh, sorry. Into Pattern Lab. You know what? If you can connect with me after this, I haven't used Pattern Lab in a hot minute, but there's another project actually right now that we are working on with a customer that's using Pattern Lab, and I can get you information on what they're doing.
Cool. So CC Lee recommended to check out another session from Wednesday. So CC, this is Laura, your room monitor. We are working on pulling down and editing all the videos, and we're going to be getting professional closed captioning and transcripts. So what I would recommend that you do, and it's at the top of the chat, is to or you can just go to YouTube and look for Drupal for Gov and just subscribe to that, and you'll get a notification. But also we'll make sure that, you know, we post on the GovCon website that the videos are now available once we get captioning in.
Yeah, and the session, it was by Mike Madison. It was on Wednesday, and it was called something along the lines of writing secure code, like something like that. And I did go ahead, I posted a link to the slides there in the
Great.
chat.
Thank you so much. So,
All right. Any other questions?
I think that's it. I don't see anything else. Let me just check the chat. Last call, a lot of thank yous. So thank you again, Beverly. There should be a break, and then we'll have more sessions coming soon in the next hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy your last day at GovCon.
Bye.
Bye.